when I was in Odessa, I was interviewing people who'd just signed up to go into the territorial defence. So, I mean, this is like as ragtag as it comes at that point. It's not quite that they were just handing out weapons to anybody. That's said a lot, it's not true. But yeah, I mean, there were huge queues of people trying to join the territorial defence. And because they wanted to defend their own land, defend their own city. It was entirely understandable. The Ukrainian army had, it was never well funded. Like in 2014, it's a longer story, but there was huge problems with funding of the army, with money disappearing. And really that makes what they managed to achieve in those early days of the invasion even more extraordinary. To hold off this supposed, one of the biggest armies in the world.
Military juggernaut.
Yeah.
Which turned out to be itself somewhat of a ragtag force.
In some respects, yeah. But they do have a lot of firepower, And somehow, I mean, it's pure David and Goliath stuff. And look, maybe if they'd taken Borispil, if they'd taken that airport near Kiev, if there's a few key points where you think, God, that could have gone so differently. They could have maybe taken Kiev or Kharkiv, but they didn't. They didn't. Kharkiv has always remained in Ukrainian hands. It's an extraordinary story. So yeah, at the time there was
You were in Kharkiv too.
Yeah, so after Odessa, I was in Odessa a few weeks, and then I thought I'll go to Kharkiv, which of course was a bit more dangerous, but it's my beloved city. I really love that place. And people would say, oh my God, you can't go to Kharkiv, it barely exists. And I'd say, no, there's a train every night. So everywhere people can be a bit melodramatic about things. Of course, it's wartime. I got to Kharkiv, and look, it was really sad, because this beautiful city I know so well, I mean, the centre is architecturally just extraordinary. And they had bombed it and bombed it and bombed it with like these massive bombs that leave huge craters. And it was like walking down the streets and everything's covered in glass and there's no one there, so all you can hear is like the crunch under your feet. It's very eerie. But my friends were there, and they were sticking on, they were volunteering, baking bread, delivering it to people living in the metro. And I was so proud of them and so happy to be there.
You referred earlier to Putin's insane article that he wrote shortly before the invasion, staking out Russia's historical claim to these territories.
Yeah.
Do you see Putin as having doubled down since then and being even more fervent about actually conquering all of Ukraine?
Well, he doesn't say that anymore, because I think he realises that he can't. But certainly not. He's certainly not backed down, has he? Yeah, I mean, the basis for this war is Russian imperial expansion. And it doesn't just affect Ukraine, by the way. I think Moldova's in danger, Poland's in danger, the Baltic states are in danger. They all know that. I wish that the rest of Europe understood that.
So you think Europe does not understand that, even though it is beginning to rearm?
Beginning to rearm, but I mean, we're years into this. It's been so slow. And a lot of that has been, leadership in Germany until recently has been very much on the fence with this. The old kind of, let's not upset Putin too much. That's been so prevalent. I mean, he's had more than 30 red lines. And what's happened? Nothing.
But hasn't Putin's strategy in a way backfired? Because, for both Trump is complaining now, apparently, according to The Economist, that the Europeans are aiding Ukraine too much and foiling his plan, his so-called peace plan.
Yeah.
And Mr. Putin has actually strengthened NATO, at least if you consider that Finland and Sweden have joined. So hasn't this actually been a colossal blunder for the Russians?
In every possible sense. I mean, they're an international pariah. There's an arrest warrant from the ICC out for Putin. One of the big things that he's managed to achieve, which I'm sure he didn't want to, is that so many Ukrainians, a massive proportion of Ukrainians, have switched from Russian language, which they speak for complex reasons, to Ukrainian language. In a way that I'm not sure you could find a historical precedent for that number of people switching and so quickly. You will not find Russian books in the shops in Kiev anymore. You will only find Ukrainian books. And so many people who had that kind of, older people in Ukraine who had a kind of nostalgia for the Soviet Union, fair to say. They're not pro-Russian. They're nostalgic for times they believed in the idea of the kind of brotherhood of nations and we're all in this together and we fought together. That's shredded. They've destroyed, they've blown it up. All those bridges, they've blown them up. So people used to say to me, Maladets Putin, well done Putin, look what you've achieved.
In a sense, I thought that Putin, and I wonder if you agree with this, was very shaped by World War II, the memory of his father fighting in World War II, and that he sees himself as resurrecting the Russian, if not the Soviet Empire, and that he is embarked upon this grand struggle to preserve Russian nationality. Do you think that that's what's going on here?
That's certainly what it's cloaked in. This is always the question with Russians at a high level, like, do they really believe this stuff? Because it's so ahistorical. The big stumbling block in that is that the narrative goes, we are basically repeating World War II by fighting Nazis. Of course, Ukraine is not run by Nazis. Its president is Jewish. It's the main stumbling block with that. And that really goes to the heart of one of the problems in Russia, is the kind of ahistorical. People believe that the Second World War, began in 1941 because they are not taught about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It is not acknowledged anymore. It briefly was. That means that their historical understanding of what actually happened in World War II is really, really partial. And so even after, the settlement, when basically so many countries were sacrificed for peace to the Soviet Union, to oppression under that regime, they would call anybody who opposed them fascists. Partisans in Ukraine, partisans in Belarus, in the Baltic states, all fascists. I'm not sure a lot of Russians I would speak to actually understood what Nazism was or what fascism meant, with the terrible irony that they now can't see that they've kind of become that themselves. If your TV is full of people screaming about eliminating Ukrainians, burning down their huts and stealing their children, you've become that thing yourself.
Now, if Putin and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, is obviously quite cynical. Putin, you say, maybe cloaking his designs, but if he's cloaking, then that implies there is some other motivation for this. If he himself doesn't actually believe, you think it's just consolidation of power? Or the resources? Oh,
for sure. No, of course. Consolidation of power is going to be Putin's primary thing.
Right.
You can't underestimate the kind of bottomless cynicism that comes from the Soviet
Do you think
period.
he needs the war, in other words, to further his crackdown on Russian society, which is what he's done?
Yeah, you can see at different periods in history how Putin has bolstered his position. There was Chechnya, that went well. It really rallied people around hating the Chechens, and the army did it again. And then there was hating the gays. That worked well too. Gay Ropa, they talk about, as if Europe is just one big pride march. And then he was he was casting about for something new. And there's this
he
war.
also Georgia.
Oh, sure, Georgia and
Crimea.
So yeah, but I think certainly that would be the idea if they had managed to just sweep through Ukraine and topple the government and take it. The really interesting question for me, though, why did they think that would happen? Why did they think that they would be met with flowers and so the FSB, the Russian intelligence services, have long had a very deep infiltration of Ukrainian society, very, very deep. They surely understood that society. They surely, if they were doing their jobs, understood that Ukrainians would not welcome the Russians with flowers at all. And yet they didn't tell Putin. Is that because they're too scared, like with Stalin? They don't want to tell the leader stuff he doesn't want? Or because they didn't know, which really is a whole other question.
Or were they being misled by the Ukrainians themselves, that they were paying, much as the U.S. on the eve of the Iraq War had to some degree become the dupe of its own propaganda?
Sure, quite possibly, but you'd hope that people trying to understand a society would do more than just talk to informers. Like they might sit, if you sat at a kitchen table in Ukraine, like a few years ago, and had a long chat with people about politics, you'd very well understand that they weren't waiting for liberation from Russia.
It is true, though, that when Putin had that meeting in the Kremlin, they announced, or heading towards war, his Confederates looked pretty queasy. Remember, he dressed down Narishkin, the head of the security services. It wasn't as though the Russian elite was gung-ho for this war. It seems more like Vladimir Putin was instrumental in fomenting it.
Absolutely, and Patrushev. I think it's important to remember the people that influence Putin are kind of quasi-fascist, like writers like Dugin, very much the idea of the Russian Empire.
So you do think that Dugin has, because my friend Christian Karl thinks that Dugin is overrated.
Sure. Look, I think at a certain point it becomes like Kremlinology, right? When we're all just going, "Oh, look, who stood to the left of Gorbachev, and what does it mean?" I think you can. I don't think there's a lot of value in endlessly looking at the psychology of Putin and what he's doing. But I think those ideas of those writers have been absolutely very, very significant for Putin. Yeah.
Well, your book has spurred us on to a whole conversation. I want to come back to your book and ask you, Night Train to Odessa, what is the main thing that you would want people to come away, or hope they might come away with, after reading your book?
This could be us. These people are not somehow completely different to us. And I really wonder, like, how my society in the UK, would we react with the kind of bravery, inspiration, courage, solidarity that I describe in every single page of this book? I hope that we would.
Thank you, Jen, for a wonderful conversation.